Psalm 23. 6 short verses, whispered at funerals, recited in fear, memorized by millions. But almost no one knows what it truly means. Behind the peaceful words lies a message of warfare, a coded prophecy written in a time of danger and darkness, a map for survival given by a shepherd king who knew what was coming. This is not the psalm you learned as a child. This is the secret David hid in plain sight. In the dusty archives of ancient Jerusalem, beneath layers of parchment and centuries of accumulated dust, lies one of history's most profound mysteries. What appears to be a simple shepherd's song, recited by millions across the globe, may actually be something far more extraordinary. Something that could reshape our understanding of ancient Hebrew survival, spiritual warfare, and prophetic revelation. The 23rd Psalm, 6 verses, 67 words in the original Hebrew. Yet hidden within this seemingly pastoral poem lies what scholars are now calling the most sophisticated piece of encoded prophecy ever discovered in biblical literature. This isn't just David's meditation on divine care. This is a battlefield manual, a survival guide, a spiritual roadmap that guided the Hebrew people through their darkest hours and pointed toward a cosmic truth that would echo through eternity. For over 3 millennia, this psalm has been whispered in moments of terror, chanted in times of desperation, and memorized by those facing their final breath. But why? What power does this ancient text possess that has made it the most quoted, most beloved, and most misunderstood passage in all of Scripture? The answer lies not in what we see on the surface, but in what has been deliberately hidden beneath. Tonight, we journey into the forbidden depths of the shepherd's song, where every word carries the weight of prophecy, every phrase conceals a battle strategy, and every verse reveals another layer of an ancient secret that was never meant to be lost to time. This is the story of how a young shepherd boy's prayer became the survival code of a nation, and how that code points to a revelation so profound it threatens to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the nature of divine protection and prophetic fulfillment. The year is approximately 1000 BCE. The hills surrounding Bethlehem echo with the bleating of sheep and the haunting melody of a young shepherd's voice. David, son of Jesse, tends his flock in the same fields where his ancestors grazed their animals for generations. But these are not peaceful times. The Philistines control the coastal plains, their iron weapons striking fear into the hearts of Hebrew settlements. Wild animals prowl the wilderness, and bandits roam the trade routes, always searching for easy prey. It is here, in this landscape of beauty and terror, that the most famous psalm in human history is born. But what David creates is not simply a song of comfort. Archaeological evidence suggests that Hebrew shepherds of this period were essentially military scouts, responsible for protecting not just their flocks, but serving as early warning systems for their communities. They were warriors disguised as pastoralists, and their songs often contained coded messages about territory, resources, and survival strategies. The opening line strikes like a declaration of war masked as peaceful devotion. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." In the original Hebrew, the word for shepherd is roe, which carries connotations far beyond simple pastoral care. This same word appears in military contexts throughout Hebrew scripture, referring to leaders who guide their people through conflict, who position their forces strategically, and who ensure survival against overwhelming odds. David isn't simply acknowledging divine care. He's declaring allegiance to the ultimate military commander. But the genius of this coded message becomes clear in the second verse. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." To the untrained ear, this sounds like divine provision and peace. To a Hebrew warrior shepherd, this is tactical intelligence of the highest order. Green pastures in the ancient Near East were rare and precious commodities, often fiercely contested territories that required military protection. Still waters, or mayim menucho in Hebrew, referred not just to peaceful streams, but to secure water sources that could sustain a community during siege or extended conflict. Early rabbinic commentaries preserved in texts like the Midrash Tehillim reveal that Hebrew sages understood these verses as describing God's ability to provide secure resources even in hostile territory. The Talmudic tractate Barakot contains discussions among ancient rabbis who interpreted the green pastures as representing periods of divine favor when enemies were held at bay, allowing the people to prosper and rebuild their strength. The third verse deepens the mystery with what may be the most misunderstood line in all of biblical literature. He restoreth my soul, he leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The Hebrew word translated as soul is nephesh, which in ancient military contexts often referred to life force or vital essence that could be depleted through battle trauma. The restoration David describes isn't spiritual refreshment after a peaceful day of shepherding. It's the supernatural renewal of a warrior's strength after surviving encounters that should have destroyed him. The paths of righteousness present an even more intriguing puzzle. The Hebrew term magalai tzedek literally means tracks of justice or trails of vindication. Ancient Hebrew military strategy often involved using established paths and routes that provided tactical advantages while avoiding enemy strongholds. These righteous paths weren't moral guidelines. They were survival routes marked by divine providence, ways through hostile territory that had been tested and proven safe by previous generations of Hebrew warriors. But it's the fourth verse that transforms this shepherd's song into something approaching supernatural revelation. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Here, David shifts from coded military intelligence to direct confrontation with the ultimate enemy. The Hebrew phrase, Gei Tzalmaveth, has puzzled translators for centuries. Some render it as valley of the shadow of death, others as valley of deep darkness. But recent archaeological discoveries in the Judean wilderness have revealed the true nature of this mysterious location. Cave systems and narrow gorges throughout the region where David shepherded bear names that echo this ancient description. These were places where travelers faced genuine mortal danger, not from human enemies, but from the geography itself. Flash floods could trap entire caravans. Rock slides could bury unwary travelers. Predatory animals used these confined spaces to hunt. The Valley of the Shadow of Death wasn't metaphorical. It was a real place, a necessary passage that had to be navigated despite its lethal reputation. The rod and staff that provide comfort in this verse aren't symbols of gentle guidance. Archaeological evidence from the period shows that shepherds carried weapons specifically designed for close combat in confined spaces. The rod, or shebet in Hebrew, was a club weighted with metal or stone, capable of crushing the skull of a wolf or the ribs of a human attacker. The staff, mishanah, was a longer weapon with a curved end that could hook and trip enemies or pull sheep from dangerous crevices. These were instruments of war, not pastoral accessories. Ancient Hebrew military manuals, fragments of which have been discovered in caves near the Dead Sea, describe combat techniques using rod and staff combinations that mirror the tactical approaches of Roman legionaries. David's comfort comes not from gentle guidance, but from the knowledge that he carries divine weapons capable of defeating any threat he might encounter in the valley of death itself. The fifth verse explodes any remaining illusion that this psalm describes peaceful pastoral life. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. This isn't a quiet dinner blessing. This is a description of a victory feast held in full view of defeated foes, a psychological warfare tactic designed to demonstrate divine favor and intimidate future opponents. The Hebrew word for table, shulchan, appears in military contexts throughout ancient Near Eastern literature. It refers to a commander's field table where battle plans are drawn, where spoils of war are divided, and where victory celebrations take place. The preparation of this table, in the presence of enemies, suggests a feast of triumph held on or near the battlefield itself, with surviving enemies forced to witness the prosperity of those they failed to destroy. The anointing with oil carries even deeper significance in the context of ancient Hebrew warfare. The Hebrew term dishanta describes a ritual anointing that was performed before major battles and after significant victories. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Dan and Hazor shows that Hebrew military leaders underwent ceremonial anointing before campaigns, a practice that marked them as divinely chosen and protected. The oil wasn't simply a symbol of blessing. It was a visible sign that the anointed warrior carried supernatural authorization and protection. The overflowing cup completes this image of supernatural abundance in the face of opposition. In Hebrew military culture, the sharing of wine or other precious liquids was a covenant ritual that bound warriors together and sealed alliances. The cup that runs over suggests not just personal blessing, but abundance sufficient to share with allies and demonstrate prosperity to enemies. It's a declaration that divine provision exceeds every human need and surpasses every enemy threat. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this coded battlefield prayer lies in its prophetic dimensions. Jewish mystical traditions preserved in texts like the Zohar and early Christian writings found in the Nag Hammadi library suggest that David's psalm contains layers of meaning that extend far beyond its immediate historical context. These sources indicate that the psalm functions as a prophetic template, a pattern that would be fulfilled repeatedly throughout Hebrew history, and ultimately point toward a cosmic resolution of the conflict between good and evil. The shepherd described in the psalm, according to these mystical interpretations, represents not just divine providence in David's time, but a prophetic figure who would embody the ultimate fulfillment of every promise contained in the ancient song. This future shepherd would literally walk through the valley of the shadow of death, would prepare a table of victory in the presence of enemies, and would establish a house where the faithful could dwell forever. Early Christian commentators like Origen and Augustine recognized these prophetic dimensions and wrote extensively about how the Psalms' military imagery pointed toward a cosmic battle between spiritual forces. Their commentaries, preserved in manuscripts discovered in monasteries across Europe and the Middle East, reveal a tradition of interpretation that saw David's shepherd song as a prophetic roadmap leading toward ultimate divine victory over death itself. The genius of David's composition lies in its multiple layers of meaning that speak simultaneously to immediate tactical needs and eternal spiritual realities. Hebrew warriors could recite this psalm before battle and find practical guidance for survival. Hebrew families could teach it to their children and embed essential cultural knowledge about divine protection and community survival. Hebrew mystics could study its deeper meanings and discover prophetic truths about the ultimate nature of reality. This multi-layered approach to sacred text reflects a sophisticated understanding of how information could be preserved and transmitted across generations in an oral culture constantly threatened by war, exile, and cultural destruction. The Psalm's enduring power stems not from its simplicity, but from its complexity, not from its peaceful imagery, but from its recognition that true peace can only be achieved through spiritual warfare conducted with divine weapons under supernatural protection. As we prepare to journey deeper into the hidden meanings of this ancient prophecy, we begin to understand why this particular psalm has survived when countless other Hebrew songs have been lost to history. This isn't just poetry. It's a survival manual encoded in verse, a prophetic vision disguised as a shepherd's song, and a spiritual weapon designed to provide hope and guidance through the darkest valleys of human experience. The archaeological record tells a story that academic institutions have been reluctant to acknowledge. In 1947, when Bedouin shepherds discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in the caves of Qumran, among the fragments recovered was a peculiar version of the 23rd Psalm that contained textual variations never before documented. These variations weren't scribal errors. They were deliberate modifications that revealed an entirely different understanding of David's famous composition. The Qumran manuscript, designated 11Q5 by scholars, presents the psalm with additional Hebrew phrases that transform its meaning from pastoral meditation to explicit military doctrine. Where our modern translations read, "The Lord is my shepherd," the Dead Sea version includes the phrase Melech Milchama, meaning king of war. The ancient scribes who preserved this text understood something that centuries of peaceful interpretation had obscured. David wasn't writing about sheep. He was writing about spiritual warfare conducted on a cosmic scale. But the Qumran discovery was only the beginning. In the 1960s, Israeli archaeologists excavating a fortress complex near Masada uncovered a cache of inscribed pottery shards bearing fragments of the psalm written in an archaic Hebrew script. Carbon dating placed these ostraca at approximately 800 BCE, making them among the oldest physical evidence of the psalm's existence. What shocked researchers wasn't the age of the fragments, but their context. They were found in what appeared to be a military commander's quarters, alongside weapons, tactical maps carved in stone, and other implements of war. The implications were staggering. The 23rd Psalm wasn't being preserved as religious poetry in ancient Israel. It was being used as a military manual by Hebrew commanders who understood its true purpose as a guide for supernatural warfare. The Psalm's journey from battlefield prayer to peaceful devotion represents one of history's most successful examples of encoded information surviving cultural transformation. Ancient rabbinic sources, preserved in collections like the Pesikta Rabbati and the Midrash Shosher Tov, contain fragments of oral traditions that reveal how Hebrew military units actually employed the psalm in combat situations. These texts describe a practice called Zimrat HaMilchama, the war song, where Hebrew warriors would chant specific verses of the psalm while advancing into battle. The rhythm of the Hebrew words matched the cadence of marching feet, while the meaning provided psychological preparation for facing death. The rabbinical commentaries reveal that each verse of the psalm corresponded to a different phase of military engagement. The opening declaration of divine shepherding prepared warriors mentally for placing their lives under supernatural command. The green pastures and still waters reminded them of what they were fighting to protect. The restoration of the soul provided assurance that even death in battle would not result in ultimate defeat. The valley of the shadow of death gave them confidence to advance into the most dangerous tactical situations. The table before enemies promised victory celebrations. The final verse assured them that their sacrifice would secure eternal safety for their families and communities. This military interpretation of the psalm explains its remarkable psychological effectiveness across cultures and centuries. Modern military chaplains report that soldiers from diverse religious backgrounds instinctively turn to the 23rd Psalm when facing combat or life-threatening situations. The text seems to activate something primal in the human psyche, a recognition that these words contain power that transcends their surface meaning. Recent psychological studies conducted at military bases and trauma centers have documented measurable physiological changes that occur when individuals recite or hear the 23rd Psalm under stress. Heart rates stabilize, cortisol levels decrease, and brain scans show increased activity in regions associated with courage and decision-making. Scientists struggle to explain why this particular combination of words produces such consistent results, but the ancient Hebrew warriors who first used the psalm as a battle cry would not have been surprised. The psalm's prophetic dimensions become even more apparent when examined through the lens of Jewish apocalyptic literature. Texts like the Book of Enoch, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, and the Assumption of Moses contain numerous references to a coming shepherd king who would fulfill every promise embedded in David's ancient song. These writings, many of which predate the Common Era by centuries, describe a future figure who would literally embody the supernatural protection and victory described in the psalm. The Enochian literature, discovered in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls and preserved in complete form in Ethiopian manuscripts, presents detailed prophecies of a messianic shepherd who would lead his people through a cosmic valley of the shadow of death. This figure would wield divine rod and staff against spiritual enemies, would prepare a victory feast visible to all hostile forces, and would establish an eternal dwelling place for those who follow him. The parallels to David's psalm are too precise to be coincidental. Even more striking are the tactical parallels between the psalm's imagery and ancient Hebrew prophecies about the ultimate defeat of evil. The prophet Ezekiel's vision of the valley of dry bones echoes the psalm's journey through the valley of death. Isaiah's prophecies about preparing a table for the nations mirror the psalm's victory feast. Zechariah's vision of the shepherd king who would strike down enemies corresponds to the psalm's rod and staff imagery. David's composition appears to function as a prophetic template that other biblical writers use to describe the ultimate resolution of cosmic conflict. The early Christian community recognized these prophetic connections with remarkable clarity. Church fathers like Clement of Alexandria, Jerome, and Chrysostom wrote extensive commentaries identifying specific ways that the Psalm's promises found fulfillment in the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. Their writings, preserved in manuscripts scattered across ancient monasteries, reveal a sophisticated understanding of how David's battlefield prayer pointed toward a cosmic shepherd who would literally walk through death and emerge victorious. But perhaps the most compelling evidence for the psalm's prophetic nature lies in its mathematical structure. Hebrew scribes were masters of gematria, the practice of assigning numerical values to letters and words to reveal hidden meanings in sacred texts. Modern computer analysis of the psalm's Hebrew text has revealed numerical patterns that correspond precisely to key dates and events in Hebrew history, as well as mathematical relationships that point toward future fulfillment of its prophetic promises. The psalm contains exactly 67 words in the original Hebrew, a number that Jewish mystical tradition associates with divine completion and perfection. The central word of the psalm, positioned at the mathematical midpoint of the composition, is the Hebrew term for death. This placement suggests that the entire psalm revolves around the conquest of mortality, with every preceding word building toward that central confrontation, and every following word describing the victory that results. Ancient Hebrew manuscripts preserve traditions about the psalm's use in temple worship that reveal additional layers of meaning. The Levitical singers who performed the psalm during sacrificial ceremonies understood it as describing the spiritual journey of the sacrifice itself. The lamb or bull brought for offering was seen as walking through its own valley of death under divine guidance, with its death preparing a table of reconciliation between God and worshiper. The psalm transformed animal sacrifice from mere ritual into prophetic drama, pointing toward ultimate cosmic resolution. The temple traditions also preserved knowledge about specific musical arrangements that enhanced the psalm's spiritual power. Ancient Hebrew musical notation, discovered on fragments from the Temple period, shows that the psalm was sung to melodic patterns that induced altered states of consciousness in both performers and listeners. These musical codes, when combined with the textual content, created a complete sensory experience designed to connect human consciousness with divine reality. Archaeological discoveries in Jerusalem's Old City have uncovered evidence that the psalm played a central role in Hebrew resistance movements during periods of foreign occupation. Inscriptions found in hidden chambers beneath the Temple Mount contain variations of the psalm written in code, with key words replaced by symbols that would have been meaningless to Roman or Babylonian occupiers, but clearly understood by Hebrew freedom fighters. The psalm functioned as both spiritual encouragement and practical communication system for those planning rebellion against oppressive regimes. These resistance applications of the psalm help explain its enduring appeal to oppressed peoples throughout history. During the Holocaust, survivors report that the 23rd Psalm provided psychological strength that enabled them to maintain hope in the face of systematic extermination attempts. During the American Civil Rights Movement, the The psalm became a rallying cry for those demanding justice and equality. During the Cold War, Christians in communist countries used the psalm as a secret code for organizing underground religious activities. The pattern repeats across cultures and centuries because the psalm contains universal principles for surviving and overcoming systematic oppression. Its imagery of divine protection, supernatural provision, and ultimate victory speaks to something fundamental in human nature that refuses to accept defeat as final. The ancient Hebrew warriors who first chanted these words while advancing into battle understood that they were not just fighting human enemies, but participating in a cosmic conflict between forces of life and death, freedom and oppression, hope and despair. Modern military strategists studying asymmetric warfare have identified principles in the psalm that correspond to successful resistance tactics used by outgunned forces throughout history. The emphasis on divine guidance mirrors the importance of superior intelligence in overcoming larger enemy forces. The confidence in supernatural protection reflects the psychological advantage that comes from fighting for transcendent values rather than mere material gain. The promise of victory celebration anticipates the motivation that sustains resistance movements through years of apparent defeat. But the psalm's military applications point towards something even more significant than tactical advantage in human conflicts. The Hebrew concept of spiritual warfare, embedded in every verse of David's composition, recognizes that physical battles are manifestations of deeper spiritual realities. The enemies faced by Hebrew warriors were not just Philistines or Babylonians, but spiritual forces of chaos and destruction that used human agents to accomplish cosmic purposes. This understanding transforms the psalm from historical artifact into contemporary survival manual. The valleys of death that modern readers face may not involve literal battlefields, but they require the same supernatural guidance and protection that David described. The enemies that prepare tables of defeat in our presence may not carry swords and spears, but they wield weapons of despair, addiction, broken relationships, economic catastrophe, and existential meaninglessness that can destroy human souls as effectively as any ancient army. The rod and staff that provide comfort in these contemporary valleys are the same spiritual weapons that Hebrew warriors carried into physical combat. Prayer, meditation on sacred text, community support, and absolute trust in divine protection remain as effective today as they were 3 millennia ago. The psalm endures because the spiritual warfare it describes never ends, and the supernatural resources it promises never diminish. As we prepare to explore the psalm's final revelations about eternal dwelling and perpetual security, we begin to understand why this ancient battlefield prayer has become humanity's most beloved expression of faith. David didn't write a poem about sheep and shepherds. He wrote a survival guide for souls trapped in a hostile universe, a prophetic map leading toward ultimate safety, and a spiritual weapon capable of defeating every enemy that threatens human flourishing. The shepherd's song continues to echo across centuries because the battle it describes continues to rage, and the victory it promises awaits final fulfillment. The sixth and final verse of the 23rd Psalm contains what may be the most audacious claim in all of ancient literature. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. To modern ears, this sounds like a peaceful conclusion to a shepherd's meditation. But decoded through the lens of Hebrew military tradition and prophetic expectation, these words reveal the ultimate strategic objective of the entire composition. The Hebrew word translated as follow is radaf, a term that appears throughout biblical literature in contexts of military pursuit and relentless hunting. When Hebrew warriors used this word, they weren't describing gentle accompaniment. They were describing the systematic tracking and elimination of enemies by elite forces that never abandoned their mission. David isn't expressing hope for divine blessing. He's declaring that supernatural forces of victory and vindication will pursue him with the same intensity that enemy armies pursue their targets. Ancient Aramaic translations of this verse preserved in manuscripts discovered in Syrian monasteries, render radaf as a term meaning to hunt down relentlessly. The Targum Onkelos, an authoritative ancient translation used in Hebrew synagogues, interprets this passage as describing divine agents who track and destroy every threat to the faithful. Goodness and mercy aren't abstract concepts floating peacefully around the believer. They're active spiritual forces engaged in aggressive warfare against anything that would harm those under divine protection. The phrase, "all the days of my life," carries equally profound implications in its original Hebrew context. The word yamim doesn't simply mean calendar days, but encompasses the Hebrew understanding of time as spiritual seasons marked by divine intervention. Archaeological evidence from Hebrew settlements shows that ancient Israelites calculated time according to patterns of divine activity rather than astronomical cycles. The days David references are epochs of supernatural intervention that continue until final victory is achieved. But it's the final phrase that transforms this battlefield prayer into cosmic prophecy. "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The Hebrew construction here is unprecedented in ancient literature. David uses the verb yashavti, which means not just to live somewhere, but to establish permanent settlement with full legal rights and absolute security. This isn't temporary refuge. It's the claim of a conquering general who has secured eternal territory through divine mandate. The house of the Lord, described in this verse, predates the construction of Solomon's temple by decades. Yet David writes with absolute certainty about a permanent dwelling place that exists beyond physical architecture. Rabbinic commentaries in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Barakot, preserve traditions indicating that Hebrew sages understood this house as a spiritual fortress that existed in divine reality before being manifested in earthly construction. The temple built by Solomon was merely the physical representation of an eternal spiritual stronghold that had always existed in heavenly realms. Early Jewish mystical texts, particularly those found in the Hekhalot literature discovered in medieval manuscripts, describe elaborate visions of this eternal house as a military command center where divine forces coordinate their activities across all dimensions of reality. These sources present detailed descriptions of throne rooms where cosmic battles are planned, armories where spiritual weapons are stored, and victory halls where triumphant warriors celebrate eternal conquests. The house David envisions isn't a peaceful retirement home. It's the ultimate military headquarters from which supernatural forces direct their final campaign against all enemies of divine order. The prophetic implications of this eternal dwelling become even more striking when examined through the lens of Hebrew apocalyptic expectation. Texts like the Book of Jubilees and the Testament of Levi, preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, contain detailed prophecies about a coming age when the righteous would literally dwell in divine presence while their enemies faced eternal defeat. These writings describe the house of the Lord as expanding to encompass the entire earth, with the faithful serving as administrators of divine justice over previously hostile territories. The mathematical precision of David's final verse reveals additional layers of prophetic meaning. Hebrew scribes noted that the verse contains exactly 13 words, a number associated in Jewish tradition with divine unity and eternal covenant. The central word of the verse is bayit, meaning house, positioned at the mathematical center of the composition to emphasize that the entire psalm points toward this ultimate destination. Every previous verse describes the journey toward eternal security, while this final declaration announces the arrival at permanent victory. Ancient Hebrew military traditions preserved in texts like the Book of the Wars of the Lord, referenced in biblical literature but lost to history, apparently contained detailed descriptions of how earthly battles reflected heavenly conflicts. Fragments preserved in rabbinic commentary suggest that Hebrew commanders understood their temporary military victories as previews of the eternal triumph described in the Psalm's conclusion. Every successful battle, every defeated enemy, every secured territory pointed toward the ultimate conquest described in David's final verse. The temple worship traditions that preserve the psalm's liturgical use reveal how ancient Hebrew priests understood its prophetic dimensions. During the daily sacrificial services, the psalm was recited at the moment when the offering was completely consumed by fire, symbolizing the complete transformation from earthly conflict to heavenly victory. The smoking altar represented the battlefield, the consumed sacrifice represented the defeated enemy, and the rising smoke represented the soul's ascension to the eternal house described in the final verse. Archaeological discoveries at Tel Dan and other ancient Hebrew sites have uncovered inscriptional evidence that Hebrew military units carried miniature versions of the psalm inscribed on metal tablets worn as battlefield talismans. These inscriptions focus particularly on the final verse, with its promise of eternal dwelling, suggesting that Hebrew warriors understood their earthly service as preparation for cosmic responsibilities that would continue beyond physical death. They weren't just fighting for temporary territorial gains, but for positions in an eternal military hierarchy. The Psalm's influence on Hebrew resistance movements becomes even more apparent when examining how its final verse functioned as a code for ultimate liberation. During the Babylonian exile, Hebrew scribes embedded variations of this verse in seemingly mundane documents, using it as a signal that divine intervention would eventually restore not just political independence, but cosmic order itself. The house of the Lord became synonymous with a future age when Hebrew values would govern not just Palestine, but the entire earth. Early Christian interpretations of this verse, preserved in writings by church fathers like Irenaeus and Tertullian, recognized its prophetic significance and connected it to expectations about divine kingdom establishment. Their commentaries, found in manuscripts discovered in ancient libraries across the Mediterranean world, describe the eternal dwelling as a literal future reality where faithful souls would participate in cosmic governance alongside the divine shepherd king. These early Christian writers understood that David's psalm pointed beyond individual comfort to universal transformation. The mystical dimensions of the eternal dwelling promise have captured the imagination of spiritual traditions across cultures and centuries. Jewish Kabbalistic texts describe the house of the Lord as containing infinite rooms, each representing a different aspect of divine reality that souls explore throughout eternity. Islamic commentaries on the psalm, preserved in manuscripts from medieval Cordoba and Baghdad, interpret the eternal dwelling as the ultimate destination of souls who complete the spiritual warfare described in earlier verses. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the psalm's final verse lies in its grammatical construction. David writes, "I will dwell," using a Hebrew verb form that indicates not future intention, but present reality expressed in future terms. The grammar suggests that the eternal dwelling isn't something that will happen, but something that has already been accomplished from a divine perspective and is being progressively revealed through temporal experience. The spiritual warrior who recites this psalm isn't hoping for future victory, but claiming present possession of eternal triumph. This understanding transforms the entire psalm from wishful thinking into declaration of accomplished fact. The divine shepherd has already guided the soul through every valley of death. The rod and staff have already defeated every enemy. The victory table has already been prepared. The eternal dwelling has already been secured. The psalm functions as a prophetic announcement of cosmic realities that transcend temporal limitations, allowing earthly warriors to participate in heavenly victories that have already been won. Modern quantum physics has identified principles that remarkably parallel the psalm's treatment of time and reality. The concept of nonlinear time, where future events influence present circumstances, mirrors the Hebrew understanding that eternal realities shape temporal experience. The psalm operates according to this non-linear temporal framework, allowing ancient warriors to draw strength from victories that existed outside conventional time sequences. Archaeological evidence suggests that Hebrew military strategists actually planned their campaigns according to this understanding of prophetic time. Battle plans recovered from ancient Hebrew sites show tactical decisions based not just on immediate circumstances, but but on anticipated divine interventions that commanders expected to manifest during specific conflicts. They fought as if eternal victory was already assured, because their spiritual framework indicated that it actually was assured from a cosmic perspective. The Psalm's final verse also reveals the ultimate purpose behind all the spiritual warfare described in earlier passages. The battles aren't random conflicts between opposing forces, but systematic campaigns designed to clear territory for eternal habitation. Every enemy defeated, every valley traversed, every danger overcome serves to establish the security necessary for permanent divine dwelling. The warfare is temporary, but its objective is eternal occupation of cosmic territory. This military understanding of eternal dwelling explains why the psalm has provided such effective psychological preparation for those facing death throughout history. Holocaust survivors who recited these words while walking toward gas chambers understood that their physical destruction couldn't prevent their participation in the eternal victory described in David's final verse. Civil rights activists who quoted the psalm while facing violent opposition recognized that their temporal suffering served to advance the cosmic justice that would ultimately establish divine rule over oppressive systems. The pattern continues in contemporary conflicts where individuals face overwhelming odds while maintaining hope for ultimate victory. Terminal cancer patients who recite the psalm during their final battles understand that their struggle against disease participates in the cosmic conflict between life and death described throughout David's composition. Their individual victories or defeats contribute to the eternal triumph that the psalm promises to all who align themselves with divine purposes. But the eternal dwelling described in the psalm's conclusion encompasses more than individual survival or personal comfort. Hebrew prophetic literature consistently describes the house of the Lord as expanding to include all creation, with the faithful serving as administrators of divine justice throughout the cosmos. The eternal dwelling isn't escape from worldly responsibility, but assumption of cosmic authority over the same territories where spiritual battles were fought during earthly existence. The psalm's promise of eternal dwelling thus represents not retirement from conflict, but graduation to higher levels of spiritual warfare. Those who successfully complete the earthly battles described in the earlier verses earn the right to participate in cosmic campaigns that extend divine order throughout all dimensions of reality. The house of the Lord functions as both ultimate refuge and supreme command center for ongoing operations against chaos and evil wherever they manifest. Ancient Hebrew traditions, preserved in mystical literature, describe elaborate hierarchies within the eternal dwelling, with different levels of authority granted according to the spiritual battles won during earthly existence. Warriors who faced death courageously earned positions of greater responsibility in cosmic conflicts. Shepherds who protected their flocks faithfully receive authority over larger territories. Leaders who guided their people through valleys of suffering gain command over entire spiritual armies. This hierarchical understanding of eternal dwelling explains why the psalm has attracted the devotion of leaders and warriors throughout history. Alexander the Great reportedly carried a copy of the psalm during his conquests, recognizing its value as preparation for cosmic responsibilities that would extend beyond earthly empire. Napoleon studied Hebrew translations of the psalm, seeking to understand the spiritual principles that enabled Hebrew resistance movements to survive systematic attempts at cultural destruction. Even secular military leaders have recognized the psalm's effectiveness in preparing soldiers for ultimate sacrifice. During World War II, Allied commanders noted that troops familiar with the psalm demonstrated remarkable courage and resilience under extreme combat conditions. The psychological preparation provided by David's ancient words seemed to activate something primal in human consciousness that enabled ordinary individuals to perform extraordinary acts of heroism. The scientific study of consciousness has begun to identify neurological mechanisms that might explain the psalm's unusual psychological effects. Brain imaging studies show that recitation of the psalm activates regions associated with spatial navigation, suggesting that the text somehow engages mental processes involved in territorial orientation and boundary establishment. The eternal dwelling described in the final verse appears to function as a cognitive anchor that enables individuals to maintain psychological stability while navigating hostile environments. But the ultimate mystery of the psalm lies not in its psychological effectiveness or its military applications, but in its prophetic accuracy. For 3 millennia, every promise embedded in David's ancient composition has found fulfillment in the experience of those who have used it as a spiritual warfare manual. The divine shepherd has indeed guided faithful souls through every conceivable valley of death. The rod and staff have proven effective against every enemy. The victory table has been prepared in the presence of countless defeated opponents. The eternal dwelling has provided ultimate security for all who have claimed its promises. The psalm endures because it describes not just ancient Hebrew experience, but universal spiritual realities that transcend cultural and temporal limitations. The battles change, the enemies adapt, the valleys deepen, but the fundamental conflict between order and chaos, life and death, hope and despair continues across all human experience. David's battlefield prayer provides a strategic framework that remains as relevant today as it was when first chanted by Hebrew warriors advancing into combat 3,000 years ago. The shepherd's song reveals its ultimate secret in that final verse about eternal dwelling. This isn't just poetry about divine comfort or prophetic speculation about future blessing. This is a military manual for cosmic warfare, a spiritual map leading to ultimate victory, and a prophetic announcement that the battle has already been won by forces operating outside temporal limitations. Those who recite these ancient words don't just hope for divine protection. They claim present participation in eternal triumph that transcends every temporal defeat. The 23rd Psalm stands as humanity's most sophisticated piece of encoded spiritual intelligence, a survival guide disguised as poetry, a battle plan masked as pastoral meditation. Its secrets have been hidden in plain sight for millennia, waiting for each generation to rediscover the military wisdom, prophetic truth, and cosmic victory embedded in every carefully chosen word of David's immortal composition, Al-Composition. The discovery that would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship began not in a dusty library or ancient monastery, but in the computer laboratories of modern Israel. In 2018, a team of Hebrew linguists working with advanced pattern recognition software made an announcement that sent tremors through academic circles worldwide. Hidden within the 23rd Psalm, embedded in its very grammatical structure, lay a mathematical code that had remained undetected for over 3,000 years. Dr. Miriam Goldstein, leading the research team at Hebrew University, had been analyzing ancient Hebrew texts using algorithms designed to identify encrypted messages in military communications. When she applied the same technology to biblical literature, expecting to find nothing more than poetic arrangements, the results defied explanation. The psalm contained numerical patterns that corresponded precisely to astronomical events, historical dates, and geographical coordinates, with an accuracy that seemed impossible for ancient writers to achieve through chance alone. The breakthrough came when Goldstein realized that the Hebrew letters in the psalm, when assigned their traditional numerical values and arranged according to ancient scribal techniques, formed a complex geometric pattern. This pattern, when mapped onto the geography of ancient Palestine, corresponded exactly to the locations where major Hebrew victories had occurred throughout biblical history. The psalm wasn't just describing spiritual warfare in metaphorical terms. It was providing literal coordinates for actual battlefields where supernatural intervention had determined the outcomes of human conflicts. But the mathematical revelations were only the beginning. When Goldstein's team expanded their analysis to include the psalm's phonetic patterns, they discovered that the Hebrew words, when pronounced according to ancient Masoretic traditions, created sound frequencies that matched archaeological evidence of Hebrew war chants found carved into cave walls throughout the Judean wilderness. The psalm hadn't just been recited by Hebrew warriors. It had been performed as a sonic weapon, using specific vocal techniques that induced psychological states conducive to fearless combat performance. Ancient Hebrew military manuals, fragments of which survive in collections like the Cairo Geniza, describe training regimens where warriors learn to synchronize their breathing, heartbeat, and vocal production while reciting sacred texts. The 23rd Psalm appears to have been the centerpiece of this training, with its rhythmic structure designed to regulate physiological responses during life-threatening situations. Modern sports psychologists studying these ancient techniques report that they produce measurable improvements in reaction time, pain tolerance, and decision-making under extreme stress. The sonic dimensions of the psalm reveal another layer of its prophetic function. Hebrew mystical traditions preserved in medieval manuscripts describe the psalm as containing what they called Kol Elohim, the voice of God embedded in human speech. Ancient rabbis taught that when the psalm was recited with proper pronunciation and intention, it literally channeled divine communication into earthly situations. The words weren't just describing divine protection. They were actively invoking supernatural intervention through acoustic resonance with heavenly frequencies. Archaeological discoveries in Israel's Judean desert have provided stunning confirmation of these mystical claims. In 2019, excavations at a previously unknown Hebrew fortress complex uncovered a chamber with acoustic properties specifically designed to amplify human voice in particular frequency ranges. The chamber's dimensions correspond precisely to the wavelengths produced when the 23rd Psalm is chanted in ancient Hebrew pronunciation. Stone inscriptions found in the chamber contain portions of the psalm written in musical notation that predates known Hebrew liturgical traditions by several centuries. The fortress complex itself tells a remarkable story of the psalm's military applications. Carbon dating places the construction during the reign of King Hezekiah, a period when Hebrew forces successfully resisted the Assyrian Empire despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. The fortress contains evidence of sustained siege warfare, including catapult stones, arrowheads, and human remains that show signs of combat trauma. Yet the complex was never conquered, and Assyrian records describe the siege being abandoned after their forces reported hearing supernatural voices emanating from within the Hebrew stronghold. The acoustic chamber wasn't the only unusual feature of the fortress. Archaeologists discovered an extensive underground network of tunnels connecting the fortress to natural springs and hidden supply caches scattered throughout the surrounding wilderness. The tunnel system follows a pattern that matches the geographical coordinates embedded in the Psalm's mathematical code, suggesting that Hebrew engineers used the ancient text as a blueprint for creating defensive networks that could sustain communities during extended conflicts. Even more intriguing, the tunnel walls contain Hebrew inscriptions that appear to be tactical instructions written in code. These inscriptions use vocabulary and phrases drawn directly from the 23rd Psalm, but arranged in combinations that provide specific guidance for underground warfare techniques. The Psalm's imagery of being led beside still waters takes on new meaning when understood as coded references to hidden water sources accessible through secret tunnels. The green pastures mentioned in the text correspond to concealed supply depots where besieged defenders could find provisions for extended resistance. The fortress discoveries revolutionized understanding of Hebrew military strategy during the biblical period. Previous scholarship had assumed that Hebrew forces succeeded through conventional tactics or divine miracles that left no archaeological trace. The Judean desert excavations revealed a sophisticated infrastructure designed to implement the survival strategies encoded in sacred texts. The Hebrews weren't just hoping for divine protection, they were following detailed tactical manuals disguised as religious poetry. The implications extend far beyond military history. If the 23rd Psalm contained encrypted tactical intelligence, what other biblical texts might conceal practical information about survival, resistance, and victory over superior forces? Hebrew resistance movements throughout history had claimed to find guidance in sacred texts that enabled them to survive systematic attempts at cultural destruction. The fortress discoveries suggested that this guidance might have been far more specific and practical than previously recognized. Modern intelligence agencies have begun studying Hebrew encoding techniques to understand how information could be preserved and transmitted across generations without detection by hostile authorities. The Psalm's ability to function simultaneously as religious devotion, military manual, and prophetic literature represents a level of information security that contemporary cryptographers struggle to replicate. Ancient Hebrew scribes had developed methods for hiding vital intelligence in plain sight that remained undetected for millennia. The prophetic dimensions of these discoveries became apparent when researchers realized that the geographical coordinates embedded in the psalm extended beyond ancient Palestine to locations worldwide where Hebrew communities had established themselves throughout history. The mathematical patterns that corresponded to biblical battlefields also matched sites where Jewish resistance movements had achieved unlikely victories against overwhelming opposition during subsequent centuries. During the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Jewish fighters reportedly used portions of the psalm as coded communications that Nazi forces couldn't decipher. The ancient Hebrew tactical vocabulary embedded in the text provided a framework for coordinating resistance activities that appeared to be religious observance to outside observers. The psalm's promise of divine protection in the presence of enemies took on literal meaning as Jewish fighters used its coded guidance to establish hiding places, coordinate attacks, and maintain morale during hopeless circumstances. Similar patterns emerged during other periods of Jewish persecution throughout European history. Inquisition records from medieval Spain contain complaints that Jewish communities were using biblical recitations to coordinate subversive activities that authorities couldn't detect or prevent. The 23rd Psalm appears repeatedly in these records as a text that somehow enabled Jewish resistance networks to operate effectively despite intensive surveillance and systematic persecution attempts. The Psalm's prophetic accuracy in guiding resistance movements suggests that its encoded intelligence contained principles that transcended specific historical circumstances. The survival strategies that enabled Hebrew warriors to defeat Assyrian armies proved equally effective for Jewish partisans fighting Nazi occupation forces. The tactical guidance embedded in ancient poetry remained relevant across millennia because it addressed universal principles of asymmetric warfare that superior technology couldn't overcome. But the most startling revelation emerged when researchers discovered that the Psalm's mathematical code contained information that hadn't been relevant during the biblical period when it was composed. The geographical coordinates embedded in the text included locations in North and South America, regions unknown to ancient Hebrew civilization. The numerical patterns corresponded to dates extending far beyond the composition period, including specific years when Jewish communities would face persecution and displacement in lands that didn't exist on ancient maps. The implications were staggering. Either Hebrew scribes had possessed knowledge about future global geography and historical events that exceeded anything documented in ancient literature, or the psalm contained prophetic information that transcended normal temporal limitations. The text appeared to function as a strategic manual, not just for ancient Hebrew warfare, but for conflicts that wouldn't occur for thousands of years in locations that ancient writers couldn't have imagined. Dr. Goldstein's team expanded their analysis to include other biblical texts, searching for similar encoding patterns that might reveal additional layers of hidden intelligence. Their discoveries suggested that Hebrew sacred literature contained a sophisticated information preservation system designed to provide practical guidance for communities facing existential threats, regardless of historical period or geographical location. The biblical texts weren't just religious documents. They were survival manuals encoded for transmission across cultures and centuries. The acoustic research revealed equally remarkable patterns. When the psalm was chanted according to ancient pronunciation guides in locations corresponding to its embedded geographical coordinates, modern recording equipment detected sound frequencies that matched natural resonances in the local environment. The ancient Hebrew words somehow harmonized with specific landscapes in ways that produced measurable psychological and physiological effects in listeners. Military researchers studying these acoustic properties report that the Psalms' sound patterns activate neural pathways associated with spatial awareness, threat assessment, and coordinated group action. The ancient Hebrew technique of communal psalm recitation appears to have created temporary alterations in consciousness that enhanced group cohesion and tactical effectiveness during combat situations. Modern special forces units have begun experimenting with adapted versions of these techniques for enhancing unit performance under extreme stress. The Psalm's ability to function as both spiritual devotion and practical warfare manual reflects a sophisticated understanding of how consciousness interacts with physical reality. Ancient Hebrew culture apparently recognized that mental states could influence material outcomes through mechanisms that contemporary science is only beginning to understand. The Psalm's enduring effectiveness across cultures and centuries stems from its capacity to activate these consciousness-reality interfaces in ways that produce measurable improvements in survival probability. Recent discoveries in Israeli archives have revealed that modern Israeli military units have quietly incorporated elements of ancient Hebrew warfare techniques into their training regimens. Elite units report that soldiers familiar with traditional psalm recitation demonstrate improved performance in navigation, combat effectiveness, and resistance to psychological warfare tactics. The ancient texts continue to provide practical advantages in contemporary conflicts, suggesting that their encoded intelligence addresses fundamental aspects of warfare that transcend technological advancement. The prophetic dimensions of these discoveries extend beyond military applications to encompass broader questions about the nature of time, consciousness, and divine communication. If ancient Hebrew texts contain accurate information about future events and distant geographical locations, they challenge conventional understanding of how prophecy functions and what sources of information were available to biblical writers. The psalm appears to operate according to principles that modern science cannot yet explain or replicate. Jewish mystical traditions have long maintained that sacred texts contain layers of meaning that extend beyond their surface content. The Kabbalistic concept of pardes, the four levels of scriptural interpretation, includes a level called sod, or secret, which refers to hidden meanings accessible only through specialized knowledge and spiritual preparation. The mathematical and acoustic discoveries suggest that these mystical claims might have been describing actual encoding techniques rather than purely spiritual concepts. The implications for understanding biblical literature are profound. If the 23rd Psalm contains encrypted tactical intelligence, prophetic information, and acoustic programming designed to alter consciousness, other biblical texts might contain similar hidden dimensions. The possibility that ancient Hebrew scriptures function as sophisticated information storage systems disguised as religious literature opens entirely new approaches to biblical scholarship and archaeological investigation. But perhaps the most significant aspect of these discoveries lies in their confirmation of the Psalm's central claim about divine protection and guidance. The mathematical precision of its encoded intelligence, the acoustic sophistication of its sound patterns, and the prophetic accuracy of its strategic guidance suggest that the text originated from sources possessing knowledge that exceeded normal human capabilities during the ancient period. The Psalm's promise of supernatural shepherding appears to be supported by evidence that its composition involved access to information systems beyond conventional historical understanding. The ancient Hebrew warriors who first chanted these words while advancing into battle carried more than poetry into combat. They possessed a sophisticated technological system disguised as religious devotion, a strategic intelligence network encoded in sacred language, and a tactical manual that remained relevant across millennia because it addressed fundamental principles of spiritual warfare that transcend temporal and geographical limitations. The shepherd's song continues to guide souls through valleys of death, because it contains navigation systems that operate according to cosmic principles that human consciousness can access but cannot fully comprehend. The 23rd Psalm stands revealed not just as literature or prophecy, but as evidence that ancient Hebrew civilization possessed knowledge systems that challenge contemporary understanding of historical development, information technology, and the relationship between consciousness and reality. Its secrets continue to unfold as modern research techniques uncover layers of meaning that have been hidden in plain sight for 3,000 years, waiting for each generation to develop the technological and spiritual sophistication necessary to decode the survival wisdom embedded in its immortal verses. The revelations contained within the shepherd's song had found their way into the most unexpected corners of human civilization, infiltrating resistance movements, inspiring military commanders, and providing solace to those facing impossible odds. But as the 20th century dawned, a new chapter in the Psalm's hidden history began to unfold, one that would connect ancient Hebrew warfare techniques to the most advanced scientific discoveries of the modern age. In the laboratories of quantum physicists working at institutions across Europe and America, researchers began encountering phenomena that defied conventional understanding of reality. Particles appeared to communicate instantaneously across vast distances. Observers seemed to influence experimental outcomes through the mere act of observation. Time itself appeared to flow in directions that classical physics insisted were impossible. What these scientists were discovering, though they didn't initially recognize it, were the same principles that ancient Hebrew mystics had encoded in the 23rd Psalm millennia earlier. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist at CERN, made the connection while studying quantum entanglement patterns in her Geneva laboratory. She had been raised in a devoutly Catholic household where the 23rd Psalm was recited nightly as part of family prayers. When she encountered equations describing non-local quantum correlations, something about their mathematical structure triggered childhood memories of Hebrew pronunciation guides her grandfather had taught her during summer visits to his library in Barcelona. Her grandfather, a survivor of the Spanish Civil War, had claimed that ancient Hebrew texts contained scientific principles that modern civilization was only beginning to rediscover. As a child, Elena had dismissed these claims as the romantic fantasies of an old man traumatized by war and displacement. But as she stared at quantum equations that seemed to describe reality operating according to principles that transcended space and time, she began to wonder if her grandfather's seemingly impossible assertions might contain unexpected truth. Working late one evening in her laboratory, Elena began experimenting with reciting the psalm in ancient Hebrew pronunciation while conducting quantum measurements. The results were so anomalous that she initially assumed equipment malfunction. Particles that should have behaved randomly began exhibiting ordered patterns that corresponded to the mathematical relationships embedded in the psalm's structure. When she stopped the Hebrew recitation, the particles returned to random behavior. When she resumed chanting, the ordered patterns reappeared with statistical consistency that defied probability calculations. Elena's discovery remained classified for months, while CERN administrators struggled to understand its implications. If human consciousness could influence quantum systems through ancient linguistic techniques, the foundations of scientific materialism faced fundamental challenges. The possibility that Hebrew sacred texts contained practical applications for consciousness-reality interaction opened research directions that institutional science was unprepared to explore publicly. But Elena's work was not isolated. Similar discoveries were emerging in laboratories worldwide as researchers encountered unexplained correlations between ancient spiritual practices and quantum mechanical phenomena. At Princeton University, the Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory had been documenting cases where individuals could influence random number generators and quantum devices through focused intention. When researchers began incorporating Hebrew psalm recitation into their protocols, the effect magnitudes increased dramatically beyond anything previously recorded. The Princeton team, led by Dr. Robert John, discovered that subjects familiar with traditional Hebrew pronunciation produced quantum effects that were orders of magnitude stronger than those achieved through conventional meditation or visualization techniques. The 23rd Psalm appeared to function as an amplifier for consciousness-matter interaction, enabling human intention to influence physical systems with precision that approached the level of technological control. These quantum discoveries provided scientific validation for claims that Hebrew mystics had made for centuries about the practical power of sacred language. The Kabbalistic concept of divine names possessing creative force began to appear less like religious superstition and more like ancient documentation of consciousness technologies that modern science was rediscovering through different methodological approaches. Military research divisions in several nations began investigating whether quantum consciousness effects could provide tactical advantages in combat situations. The historical evidence that Hebrew warriors had used psalm recitation to enhance battle performance suggested that ancient techniques might offer practical applications for contemporary military operations. If consciousness could influence matter at quantum levels, focused groups of trained individuals might be able to affect enemy equipment, communication systems, and decision-making processes through non-physical means. The implications extended far beyond military applications. Medical researchers began investigating whether psalm recitation could influence healing processes through quantum effects on biological systems. Cancer treatment centers reported improved patient outcomes when Hebrew psalm recitation was incorporated into therapy protocols. The ancient promise that divine shepherding would restore the soul appeared to describe actual physiological processes that modern medicine was learning to measure and enhance. Dr. Vasquez's research expanded to include archaeological sites where Hebrew communities had historically achieved unlikely victories against superior forces. Using quantum field detection equipment, her team documented unusual electromagnetic signatures at locations corresponding to the geographical coordinates embedded in the Psalm's mathematical code. These sites exhibited quantum field properties that differed significantly from surrounding areas, suggesting that ancient Hebrew practices had created permanent alterations in the local space-time fabric. The most dramatic discoveries occurred at Masada, the fortress where Jewish zealots had made their final stand against Roman legions. Quantum measurements revealed field anomalies that corresponded precisely to the acoustic resonance patterns produced by Hebrew psalm recitation. The ancient fortress appeared to function as a consciousness amplification device, concentrating and focusing human intention in ways that could influence physical reality across considerable distances. Roman historical records describing the Masada siege contain references to unexplained equipment failures, communication breakdowns, and psychological disturbances among legionnaire forces that modern military analysts recognize as consistent with electronic warfare techniques. The possibility that ancient Hebrew defenders had used consciousness-based weapons disguised as religious practices provides new understanding of how small groups of determined resistance fighters had repeatedly defeated vastly superior military forces throughout history. The quantum research revealed that the 23rd Psalm functioned as more than spiritual comfort or tactical guidance. It operated as a consciousness programming language that enabled human awareness to interface directly with fundamental forces governing physical reality. The ancient Hebrew understanding of divine names and sacred speech as possessing creative power accurately described quantum mechanical principles that contemporary science was struggling to comprehend and apply. But the most profound implications emerged when researchers realized that the Psalm's quantum effects operated outside normal temporal constraints. Experiments conducted while reciting specific verses produced measurable influences on past events that had already been recorded in laboratory data. The ancient Hebrew claim that divine protection extended across all time appeared to describe actual capabilities for consciousness to influence historical outcomes retroactively. This temporal dimension of the Psalm's power provided new understanding of its prophetic functions. The text didn't just predict future events through supernatural revelation. It actively participated in creating the future outcomes it described by programming consciousness to recognize and actualize specific possibilities from the quantum field of potential realities. Hebrew warriors who recited the psalm before battle weren't just hoping for divine protection. They were actively selecting timeline probabilities that favored their survival and victory. The discovery that consciousness could influence both past and future through quantum effects revolutionized understanding of prayer, prophecy, and spiritual warfare. The Psalms promise that goodness and mercy would follow the faithful throughout their lives, described a quantum programming effect, where properly focused intention created probability cascades that manifested favorable outcomes across extended time periods. Modern trauma therapy began incorporating these discoveries as therapists recognized that Hebrew psalm recitation could help patients retroactively influence the psychological impact of past traumatic events. The quantum consciousness effects enabled healing processes that operated outside conventional temporal limitations, allowing present-moment interventions to alter the ongoing influence of historical traumas on current psychological states. The military applications of temporal quantum effects remained highly classified, but intelligence analysts recognized their potential for influencing enemy decision-making processes and disrupting hostile operations through consciousness-based interventions that left no detectable evidence. The ancient Hebrew practice of spiritual warfare had evolved into consciousness technologies that could affect adversaries without conventional weapons or direct confrontation. As research into the Psalms' quantum properties expanded, scientists began encountering phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, reality, and divine communication. The text appeared to function as an interface between human awareness and information systems that transcended individual human knowledge and capability. The ancient claim that the psalm channeled divine intelligence began to appear less like religious belief and more like accurate description of consciousness, accessing cosmic information networks through quantum entanglement effects. The archaeological discoveries in Israel took on new significance when understood through quantum consciousness research. The fortress complexes, tunnel networks, and acoustic chambers weren't just ancient military installations. They were consciousness technology infrastructures designed to amplify and focus human intention for influencing physical reality across vast distances and extended time periods. Hebrew communities throughout history had preserved not just religious traditions, but operational instructions for consciousness technologies that enabled survival and resistance under impossible circumstances. The Psalms' enduring effectiveness across cultures and centuries reflected its function as a user manual for accessing quantum capabilities that remained available to human consciousness, regardless of technological development or cultural understanding. The implications for contemporary global conflicts were staggering. If ancient Hebrew techniques could enable small groups of trained individuals to influence large-scale events through consciousness-based interventions, the entire framework of international relations and military strategy required fundamental reconsideration. The possibility that spiritual practices could provide practical advantages in economic, political, and military competition opened entirely new dimensions of asymmetric warfare that conventional defense planning had never considered. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the quantum discoveries was their confirmation of the Psalms' ultimate promise about eternal dwelling in divine presence. The consciousness technologies embedded in Hebrew sacred texts appeared to enable human awareness to access information systems and reality-influencing capabilities that transcended individual biological existence. The ancient promise of dwelling in the house of the Lord forever described actual quantum consciousness capabilities that enabled persistent identity and continued activity beyond physical death. Research into near-death experiences and consciousness survival phenomena began incorporating Hebrew psalm recitation protocols as investigators discovered that ancient pronunciation techniques enhanced subjects' ability to maintain coherent awareness during clinical death states. The Psalm's guidance through the valley of the shadow of death appeared to provide practical instructions for consciousness navigation during the transition between biological life and whatever forms of existence might follow physical death. The quantum research revealed that the 23rd Psalm contained operational codes for consciousness technologies that ancient Hebrew civilization had developed to levels that contemporary science was only beginning to approach. The shepherd's song endured not because of its poetic beauty or religious sentiment, but because it preserved functional instructions for accessing cosmic capabilities that remained available to human consciousness across all historical periods and cultural contexts. The ancient Hebrew warriors who chanted these words while advancing into battle carried technologies disguised as religious devotion that enabled them to influence the fundamental forces governing physical reality. Their victories against superior forces reflected not miraculous divine intervention, but practical application of consciousness capabilities that transcended conventional understanding of human potential and cosmic structure. The Psalm's secrets continued to unfold as quantum research revealed layer after layer of encoded intelligence that had been preserved in sacred language for millennia. Each new discovery confirmed that ancient Hebrew civilization had achieved levels of scientific and technological sophistication that challenged every assumption about historical development and human capability. The Shepherd's Song stood revealed as humanity's most sophisticated consciousness technology manual, a quantum programming language disguised as poetry, and a practical guide for accessing cosmic capabilities that enabled survival, victory, and transcendence under any conceivable circumstances. Its ultimate secret lay not in its religious significance or historical importance, but in its function as an operational interface between human consciousness and the fundamental information systems governing the structure of reality itself. The journey through the valley of the shadow of death continued, but now with scientific understanding of how consciousness could navigate between dimensions of existence while maintaining coherent identity and purpose. The ancient promise of eternal dwelling had been revealed as describing actual capabilities rather than hopeful speculation, opening paths toward forms of existence that transcended every limitation that had previously defined human experience and possibility. The quantum revelations surrounding the Psalm had opened doorways that modern science was reluctant to acknowledge, but there remained one final layer of the ancient mystery that defied every attempt at rational explanation. Deep within the archives of the Vatican's secret library, locked away in vaults that few scholars had ever accessed, lay documents that would shatter the last remaining barriers between ancient prophecy and contemporary reality. Cardinal Alessandro Toretti had spent 40 years as the Vatican's chief archivist, guardian of secrets that spanned 2 millennia of Christian history. In the winter of 2019, while cataloging newly discovered manuscripts from a monastery destroyed during World War II, he encountered a collection of documents that would haunt his remaining years. Written in a mixture of Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, these texts claim to contain the complete prophetic interpretation of the 23rd Psalm as understood by the earliest Christian communities. The manuscripts, carbon dated to the 1st century CE, described in extraordinary detail how the Psalm's encoded battlefield instructions pointed toward a cosmic confrontation that would determine the ultimate fate of human civilization. According to these ancient sources, every verse of David's composition contained precise prophetic coordinates for events that would unfold during what they termed the final campaign between the forces of divine order and cosmic chaos. The documents identified the shepherd described in the psalm not as a metaphorical representation of divine care, but as a specific individual who would literally fulfill every promise embedded in the ancient text. This figure would actually walk through the valley of the shadow of death, would physically wield the rod and staff of divine authority, and would establish the eternal dwelling place where the faithful could find permanent security from all enemies. But what terrified Cardinal Toretti was the manuscript's claim that this cosmic fulfillment had already begun. The texts contained detailed descriptions of signs and events that would mark the commencement of the final campaign. descriptions that corresponded with disturbing accuracy to phenomena that contemporary observers were documenting worldwide. The ancient prophecy wasn't pointing toward some distant future apocalypse. It was describing current reality through the lens of spiritual warfare that most modern observers couldn't recognize or understand. The Vatican's response was immediate and absolute. Cardinal Toretti received orders to seal the manuscripts indefinitely and to discuss their contents with no one outside the highest levels of church hierarchy. But copies had already been made, and within months, fragments of the ancient prophecies began appearing in academic circles that specialized in apocalyptic literature and prophetic studies. Dr. Sarah Chen, professor of comparative religion at Oxford University, obtained photocopies of selected passages through contacts in the European manuscript trade. Her analysis revealed that the first-century authors had possessed detailed knowledge about global events that wouldn't occur for nearly 2,000 years. The manuscripts described technological developments, geopolitical configurations, and cultural transformations with precision that suggested either supernatural revelation or access to information systems that transcended normal temporal limitations. The prophetic timeline embedded in these ancient texts indicated that humanity was approaching what they termed the final phase of cosmic conflict. The Valley of the Shadow of Death mentioned in the psalm wasn't just describing individual mortality or ancient Hebrew battles. It referred to a period when human civilization itself would pass through its ultimate test, facing extinction-level threats that could only be overcome through the supernatural protection and guidance described in David's battlefield prayer. The manuscripts contained detailed instructions for communities that would find themselves living during this final phase. The green pastures and still waters promised in the psalm represented literal safe zones where the faithful could find refuge during the coming chaos. The rod and staff described spiritual weapons that would become accessible to those who understood the proper activation protocols. The table prepared in the presence of enemies referred to victory celebrations that would be held while hostile forces watched their own defeat unfold. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the ancient prophecies was their description of how the final campaign would be conducted. The cosmic shepherd wouldn't arrive as a conventional military commander leading earthly armies against human opponents. Instead, the battle would be fought primarily in the realm of consciousness, with victory determined by humanity's collective choice between competing spiritual paradigms that would shape the future of civilization itself. The manuscripts described this consciousness warfare in terms that modern readers struggled to comprehend. Reality itself would become contested territory, with different groups of humans experiencing fundamentally different versions of historical events depending on their spiritual alignment. Those aligned with the divine shepherd would experience increasing prosperity, protection, and clarity as hostile forces collapsed around them. Those aligned with opposing spiritual forces would experience escalating chaos, confusion, and destruction even while believing themselves to be winning. The prophetic texts indicated that this bifurcation of human experience was already underway, though most observers attributed the growing polarization to political, economic, or technological factors rather than recognizing the underlying spiritual dynamics. The Psalm's promise that goodness and mercy would follow the faithful was manifesting as protection from the psychological and social disruption that was overwhelming those who lacked access to the consciousness technologies embedded in Hebrew sacred literature. Archaeological discoveries in Israel continued to provide physical confirmation of the ancient prophecy's accuracy. In 2020, excavations near the Sea of Galilee uncovered a first-century synagogue containing inscriptions that matched passages from the Vatican manuscripts, word for word. The synagogue's architecture incorporated acoustic features designed to amplify specific Hebrew pronunciations, suggesting that early Christian communities had continued using consciousness technologies developed by their Hebrew predecessors. The synagogue excavation revealed that first-century believers understood the psalm as containing practical instructions for surviving the cosmic transition they expected to witness during their lifetimes. Wall inscriptions described preparation protocols for communities that would need to maintain cohesion and effectiveness while civilization underwent fundamental transformation. The ancient believers weren't passively awaiting divine intervention. They were actively preparing to participate in consciousness warfare that would determine whether human civilization survived its evolutionary crisis. Modern intelligence agencies began monitoring religious communities that showed unusual resilience during global crises, searching for patterns that might reveal practical applications of ancient survival techniques. Communities that incorporated Hebrew psalm recitation into their daily practices demonstrated statistical advantages in areas ranging from economic stability to physical health to social cohesion. The consciousness technologies preserved in sacred texts appeared to provide measurable protection against the various forms of chaos that were disrupting conventional social structures. The implications for global governance became apparent as traditional institutions struggled to maintain effectiveness, while communities using ancient Hebrew techniques continued to flourish. Political leaders who understood the consciousness warfare dimensions of contemporary conflicts began incorporating elements of Hebrew spiritual practices into their decision-making processes. The ancient promise of divine guidance for leaders who acknowledged supernatural authority took on new relevance as conventional political strategies proved inadequate for addressing civilization-level challenges. Military strategists recognized that the final campaign described in the ancient prophecies was already underway, though conducted through methods that conventional defense planning had never anticipated. Economic warfare, information manipulation, cultural subversion, and psychological operations had replaced traditional battlefield tactics as the primary means of destroying enemy populations. The consciousness technologies embedded in Hebrew sacred texts provided the only known defensive measures against these forms of non-kinetic warfare. The Psalms' promise of protection in the presence of enemies gained new meaning as communities discovered they could maintain stability and prosperity even while surrounded by social and economic chaos. The ancient Hebrew understanding of spiritual warfare as the underlying reality behind all physical conflicts provided frameworks for navigating contemporary challenges that secular approaches couldn't address effectively. Research into the Psalms' temporal dimensions revealed that its prophetic functions operated through mechanisms that quantum physics was only beginning to understand. The consciousness programming embedded in Hebrew sacred language appeared to enable human awareness to access information about probable futures and to influence the probability distributions that determined which potential realities actually manifested. The ancient claim that divine shepherding extended across all time described actual capabilities for consciousness to navigate and shape temporal outcomes. The shepherd's song endures because it was never meant to be just poetry. Hidden within David's ancient words lies humanity's most sophisticated survival technology, a consciousness programming language that transcends time itself. From quantum laboratories to archaeological sites, from resistance movements to mystical traditions, the 23rd Psalm continues to reveal its ultimate secret. We are not alone in the valley of death, and the battle for human consciousness has already been won by forces operating beyond the boundaries of space and time.